The winter of 1876 pressed down on the Dakota Territory with merciless cold. Sarah Mackenzie stood at the window of her small cabin, watching snow fall in thick curtains across the prairie. Her husband had been dead for 2 years, claimed by fever, leaving her alone on this isolated homestead with nothing but stubbornness and determination to keep her going. At 32, she had weathered storms both literal and personal, but nothing had prepared her for what she would find on that frozen February morning. She heard the sound before dawn, a weak scratching at her door that she first mistook for the wind pushing branches against the wood. But the sound came again, more desperate this time, accompanied by a low moan that made her blood run cold. Sarah grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace, her hands shaking not from fear but from the sudden rush of adrenaline. She had lived on the frontier long enough to know that anything could be waiting on the other side of that door. When she pulled it open, rifle raised, she found herself staring down at a boy. He couldn't have been more than 14, his dark eyes glazed with pain and fever. Blood had soaked through the buckskin shirt he wore, creating a dark stain that spread from his shoulder down across his chest. He was Lakota, she realized immediately, recognizing the beadwork on his clothing and the way his long black hair had been braided. The boy tried to speak, but his words came out in a language she didn't understand before he collapsed forward into the snow. Sarah made a decision in that instant that would change everything. She could have closed the door, could have pretended she never saw him, could have protected herself from the danger that helping him might bring. Relations between the settlers and the Lakota had been tense for years, growing worse after the battles that summer. Everyone knew the stories, whispered in trading posts and towns, about what happened to those caught on the wrong side of the conflict. But looking down at this wounded child bleeding into the snow, Sarah saw only a boy who needed help. She dragged him inside, using every ounce of strength she possessed. He was heavier than he looked, his body dead weight as she pulled him across the threshold and onto the rough wooden floor. The heat from the fireplace seemed to revive him slightly, and he opened his eyes again, staring up at her with a mixture of confusion and fear. She spoke softly, keeping her voice calm even as her heart hammered in her chest, trying to convey through tone what her words couldn't communicate. The wound in his shoulder was bad, she discovered as she carefully peeled away the blood-soaked leather. A bullet had torn through the flesh, missing bone but leaving a ragged injury that had bled extensively. She had treated injuries before, had learned from necessity how to clean and bind wounds after her husband's hunting accidents. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she heated water, found clean cloth, and began the painstaking work of cleaning the wound. The boy cried out several times as she worked, his body jerking with pain, but he never tried to pull away. He watched her face with those intense dark eyes, seeming to search for something in her expression. Trust, perhaps, or understanding of why this white woman would help him when so many others would have turned him away or worse. Sarah worked in silence, focusing on the task at hand, pushing away thoughts of what might come next. As dawn broke properly and light filtered through the cabin windows, she finally stepped back to examine her work. The wound was clean and bandaged, the bleeding stopped. The boy's fever still burned hot, his skin radiating heat that spoke of infection already taking hold. She knew the next few days would be critical, that his survival depended entirely on whether his body could fight off the poison in his blood. She made him as comfortable as possible on the floor near the fire, covering him with blankets and placing a cool cloth on his forehead. Looking down at him, Sarah felt the weight of her decision settling onto her shoulders. She had just taken in a wounded Lakota boy during a time when such an act could be seen as treason by her own people. If he died, she would have to explain the body. If he lived, she would have to explain why she sheltered him. And somewhere out there, she knew, someone was looking for this boy. His family wouldn't simply abandon him. They would search, and eventually, that search would lead them here. The first day passed in a blur of desperate work. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever climbing higher as infection spread through his wounded shoulder. Sarah barely left his side, changing the bandages when they soaked through with blood and pus, spooning broth between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, and praying in the quiet darkness that her efforts wouldn't be in vain. She had never been particularly religious, but she found herself bargaining with God as the hours crawled past. His fever broke late that evening, and for the first time, he looked at her with clear eyes. He spoke again in Lakota, his voice barely above a whisper, and she shook her head gently to show she didn't understand. The boy seemed to accept this, nodding slightly before closing his eyes again. But this time his sleep was natural, not the restless delirium that had gripped him before. Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief, slumping in her chair beside him and feeling exhaustion wash over her like a wave. The second day brought new challenges. The boy woke fully, his eyes sharp and alert despite the pain that tightened his young face. He tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder, and Sarah gently pressed him back down. She brought him more broth, and this time he ate hungrily, draining the bowl she offered. When he finished, he spoke again, slower this time, trying to make her understand. He pointed to himself and said a word that sounded like Ohanzi. She repeated it carefully, and his face split into a small smile when she got it right. Sarah pointed to herself and said her name clearly. The boy, Ohanzi, repeated it with his own accent, turning the simple syllables into something that sounded almost musical. It was a start, a bridge across the vast divide that separated them. Throughout that day, they continued this careful exchange, building a fragile vocabulary of gestures and sounds. He taught her words in Lakota, she taught him words in English. Food became Woyut. Water was Mini. Thank you was Pilamaya. But beneath these small moments of connection, Sarah felt a growing anxiety. She knew this couldn't last, that their isolated bubble would inevitably burst. Every time she looked out the window, she half expected to see riders on the horizon. The boy seemed to sense her fear, following her gaze whenever she checked the surrounding prairie. He never asked to leave, never tried to escape, but she could see in his eyes that he was thinking about what came next. The third day arrived with an oppressive stillness. The snow had stopped, leaving the world outside buried under a thick white blanket that sparkled in the weak winter sun. Ohanzi was strong enough to sit up on his own now, though the effort still caused him obvious pain. His fever had stayed away, and the wound in his shoulder looked cleaner, the angry redness beginning to fade. Sarah changed the bandage one more time, noting with satisfaction that the healing had begun. They ate breakfast together in companionable silence, Sarah at the rough wooden table and Ohanzi sitting wrapped in blankets by the fire. She had given him one of her late husband's shirts to wear, the sleeves too long on his smaller frame. The sight of him in James's old clothing stirred complicated emotions in her chest, grief and protectiveness tangled together in a way she couldn't fully name. She had lost so much already. The thought of losing this boy too, of failing to save him after coming this far, was unbearable. As afternoon approached, Ohanzi became restless. He stood carefully, testing his strength, and moved to the window. He stared out at the endless white prairie for a long time, his expression unreadable. Sarah joined him there, following his gaze across the frozen landscape. She wanted to ask him what he was thinking, wanted to know if he was planning to leave or if he was afraid of something coming. But the words wouldn't translate, and so they stood together in silence. The sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Sarah prepared their evening meal, another simple stew made from her dwindling supplies. They would need more food soon, she realized. Another worry to add to the growing list. As darkness fell, she lit the oil lamps and stoked the fire, performing the familiar rituals that marked the end of each day. Ohanzi watched her with those intense eyes, and she wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A savior? A captor? Simply a woman who had shown him an unexpected kindness? That night, Sarah barely slept. She lay in her bed on the other side of the small cabin, listening to Ohanzi's steady breathing and the wind that had picked up outside. Something felt different about this night, a tension in the air that made her skin prickle with awareness. She rose several times to check the window, peering out into the darkness, seeing nothing but shadows and snow. Each time she returned to bed, sleep evaded her until finally she simply gave up and sat in her chair, the rifle across her lap, waiting for something she couldn't name. Dawn was still an hour away when she heard it. The sound was so faint at first that she thought she might be imagining it, a phantom noise conjured by her exhausted mind. But then it came again, clearer this time. The distant thunder of hoofbeats, many horses moving fast across frozen ground. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she moved to the window, her hands gripping the rifle so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ohanzi was awake too, she realized, sitting up and staring toward the door with an expression she couldn't read. Fear? Hope? Relief? Perhaps all three at once. The sky was still painted with the deep purple of pre-dawn when Sarah saw them. They emerged from the morning mist like spirits, 50 mounted warriors materializing out of the half-light as if conjured from the frozen earth itself. They moved in perfect formation, their horses' breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. War paint streaked across their faces in patterns of red and black, and their weapons glinted even in the weak light. This was not a hunting party. This was an army coming for answers. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door, to hide, to prepare for the worst. But she forced herself to remain calm, to think clearly despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Behind her, Ohanzi had risen to his feet, swaying slightly with the effort. He spoke urgently in Lakota, his voice carrying a note she hadn't heard before. Not fear, she realized. Recognition. And something else that might have been relief. The warriors formed a semicircle around her cabin, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold. One rider moved forward from the group, and Sarah knew immediately that this man was their leader. He sat his horse with absolute authority, his face weathered and hard as carved stone. He was older than the others, perhaps 40, with grey threading through his long black hair. The resemblance to Ohanzi was unmistakable in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. This was the boy's father. The warrior chief dismounted with fluid grace, his movements economical and precise. He stood for a moment studying Sarah's cabin, his dark eyes taking in every detail. Then his gaze locked onto Sarah through the window, and she felt the full weight of his scrutiny. This man had killed before, she knew instinctively. He had led warriors into battle, had made decisions that cost lives and saved them. He was dangerous in a way that made her previous fears seem childish. Sarah made a decision. She couldn't hide Ohanzi, couldn't pretend he wasn't there. More importantly, she realized she didn't want to. She had saved this boy's life, and she would stand by that choice whatever came next. Moving slowly and deliberately so as not to appear threatening, she opened the door and stepped out into the freezing dawn. The rifle she left inside, a gesture of trust that might cost her everything or save her life. She couldn't be sure which. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. She wore only her simple dress and shawl, inadequate protection against the brutal temperature. But she stood straight, refusing to show weakness before these warriors who watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. The chief took several steps toward her, closing the distance between them until they stood only a few feet apart. Up close, she could see the scars that marked his face and hands, the evidence of a hard life lived in constant struggle. They stared at each other in silence for a long moment, and Sarah felt as if she were being weighed and measured, her very soul examined. Then Ohanzi appeared in the doorway behind her, and everything changed. The boy spoke rapidly in Lakota, his words tumbling over each other in his urgency. The chief's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering across his features. He responded in the same language, his deep voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. Sarah stood frozen, understanding none of the words but feeling the emotional current that ran between father and son. Ohanzi gestured toward her several times, and each time the chief's gaze returned to her face, studying her anew. The other warriors had dismounted now, forming a loose ring around the cabin. Sarah was acutely aware of how exposed she was, how easily any one of these men could end her life. But she kept her chin raised, her back straight, refusing to cower. Finally, Ohanzi fell silent, and the chief turned his full attention to Sarah once more. When he spoke, his words were in English, heavily accented but perfectly clear. "You saved my son." It wasn't a question but a statement of fact. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The chief continued, "You gave him shelter. You healed his wound. You asked for nothing." Again Sarah nodded, her throat tight with tension. The chief reached into the leather bag that hung from his belt and withdrew something. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized a bullet, the metal glinting dully in the growing light. He held it up between them, and she understood. This was the bullet she had removed from Ohanzi's shoulder, the one she had dropped into a tin cup by the fire and forgotten about in the chaos of keeping him alive. The boy must have saved it, must have shown it to his father as proof of what had been done. 3 days my son was gone, the chief said, his voice rough with emotion he kept tightly controlled. 3 days we searched. We found his blood in the snow, followed the trail to your door. He paused, his jaw tightening. I thought we would find his body. I thought we came to avenge him. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the violence that had been narrowly avoided. Sarah found her voice at last, though it came out barely above a whisper. He needed help. I couldn't turn him away. The words seemed inadequate, too simple to express the complexity of what had passed between her and Ohanzi over the last 3 days. But they were the truth, and she offered them without apology or excuse. The chief studied her for another long moment, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. The hardness didn't leave, but something else joined it. Respect, perhaps, or at least understanding. He spoke again, this time in Lakota, addressing the warriors who surrounded them. Several of them responded, their voices carrying tones of what might have been agreement or argument. Sarah couldn't tell which. Then Ohanzi spoke up again, his young voice strong despite his injury. He addressed the assembled warriors, and Sarah caught her name in the flow of words she couldn't understand. Whatever he said had an impact. She saw faces change, saw the hostility that had marked some expressions soften into something else. The boy was speaking for her, she realized. He was defending the choice she had made to save him. The sun broke over the horizon properly now, flooding the prairie with golden light that made the snow sparkle like diamonds. In that moment, standing surrounded by 50 Lakota warriors with Ohanzi's father before her, Sarah felt the surreal quality of the situation wash over her. 3 days ago she had been alone, struggling to survive another harsh winter. Now she stood at the center of something much larger than herself, caught between two worlds that had been at war. The chief raised his hand, and the warriors fell silent immediately. The gesture spoke of absolute authority, of a leader whose word was law. He turned back to Sarah, his face still unreadable, and began to speak. His English came slowly, as if he were choosing each word with great care, weighing its meaning before giving it voice. My name is Tatanka Ohitika. In your language, this means brave bull. The boy is my youngest son, my last child. His mother died bringing him into this world 14 winters ago. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding. This wasn't just a father who had come searching for his son. This was a man who had already lost the woman he loved to the same child, who had raised that boy alone while leading his people through years of conflict and hardship. The loss of Ohanzi would have been unbearable, the final cruel blow in a life already marked by suffering. No wonder he had come with 50 warriors. No wonder the paint on their faces spoke of war. Tatanka Ohitika continued, 3 days ago, we encountered soldiers. Blue coats, riding hard across our hunting grounds. They shot without warning, without reason. Ohanzi took a bullet meant for his older brother. We fought back, drove them away, but in the chaos, Ohanzi was separated from us. We searched through the night, through the storm, but the snow covered his tracks. We feared the worst. His voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the emotion beneath the words, carefully controlled but present nonetheless. This morning, we found where he had crawled through the snow. We followed his trail here, to your home. We came ready for war, ready to take vengeance if we found him dead or dying from neglect. Tatanka Ohitika's eyes locked onto Sarah's with an intensity that made her shiver. But we found something else. We found a white woman who had taken in my son, who had saved his life when she could have left him to die in the snow. Who had risked everything to show mercy to one of the people her own kind call enemy. Ohanzi spoke up again from the doorway, his voice stronger now. He moved forward to stand beside Sarah, and she noticed he was wearing his own clothes again, the buckskin cleaned and mended as best she could manage. He spoke at length to his father, gesturing occasionally toward the cabin, toward Sarah, toward his bandaged shoulder. Tatanka Ohitika listened without interruption, his expression giving nothing away. When Ohanzi finished, his father was silent for a long moment. The assembled warriors waited, the only sound the soft snorting of horses and the whisper of wind across the frozen prairie. Then Tatanka Ohitika spoke again, this time in Lakota, addressing his son directly. The conversation that followed was rapid and intense, father and son speaking with the ease of people who knew each other's minds. Sarah watched the interplay between them, seeing affection and respect mixed with the natural tension between a protective parent and a headstrong youth. Finally, Tatanka Ohitika turned back to Sarah. My son tells me you fed him, kept him warm, changed his bandages many times. He says you showed him kindness when you could have shown him hate. He says you were afraid, but you did not let fear turn you cruel. The chief paused, then added quietly, he says you cried when you thought he would die from fever. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. She hadn't realized Ohanzi had been aware during those darkest hours, when she had indeed shed tears of frustration and fear while trying to break his fever. I did what anyone should do, she said simply. He was hurt. He was a child. Nothing else mattered. But it does matter, Tatanka Ohitika responded, his voice sharp. Everything matters. Your people and mine have been at war. Blood has been spilled on both sides. Many of my warriors have lost family to white bullets. They wanted to come here with anger, wanted to make someone pay if we found my son dead. You could have been that someone. But instead, you gave us back what we thought was lost. He turned and spoke to the assembled warriors in Lakota, his voice carrying across the frozen ground. Sarah watched as the men listened, saw their faces register a range of emotions. Some nodded in agreement with whatever their chief was saying. Others looked skeptical, their expressions hard. But all of them listened with absolute attention, the respect for their leader evident in every posture. When Tatanka Ohitika finished speaking, one of the older warriors dismounted and approached. He carried a bundle wrapped in leather, and he stopped before Sarah, his weathered face studying her intently. He spoke in Lakota, his voice formal and precise. Tatanka Ohitika translated, "This is Wonbli, which means eagle. He is my brother and my counsel. He says that the life of a chief's son cannot be repaid with simple thanks. He says that you have created a debt of honor that must be acknowledged." The warrior named Wonbli unwrapped the bundle, revealing a beautiful blanket. It was woven in patterns of red, white, and black, with intricate designs that spoke of countless hours of careful work. He held it out to Sarah, and she took it with trembling hands, feeling the soft weight of it. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each thread placed with purpose and skill. This was clearly a precious item, something meant to be treasured. But Wonbli wasn't finished. He spoke again, and Tatanka Ohitika's translation came with what might have been the hint of a smile. He says that a blanket is not enough. That you will need more than beauty to survive the winter alone. At a gesture from Wonbli, other warriors began unloading supplies from their horses. Dried meat appeared, bundles of it wrapped carefully in leather. Bags of pemmican, the mixture of fat and berries that could sustain life through the harshest weather. Firewood, already cut and ready to burn. The pile of offerings grew steadily as more warriors contributed. Sarah stood speechless, overwhelmed by the sudden generosity. These men who had arrived at dawn ready for war were now ensuring she would survive the winter. The reversal was so complete, so unexpected, that she felt tears prick at her eyes. "I don't understand," she managed to say. "This is too much. I only did what was right." Tatanka Ohitika shook his head. "You gave life. We honor life. This is our way." He paused, then added, "But there is something more. A debt of honor is not paid with gifts alone. It creates a bond, a connection between giver and receiver. You saved my son. That makes you family to us, whether you wish it or not." The weight of those words settled over Sarah like the blanket in her arms. Family. She had been alone for so long, struggling through each day with only memories for company. The idea that she might have gained family through this strange and frightening encounter seemed impossible. Yet looking at the faces of these warriors, seeing the way Ohanzi smiled at her from where he stood with his father, she began to believe it might be true. Tatanka Ohitika gestured toward the cabin, a question in the movement. Sarah nodded and led the way inside, followed by the chief, Ohanzi, and Wonbli. The small space felt even smaller with the four of them filling it, but Sarah busied herself stoking the fire and putting water on to boil. It was the only hospitality she could offer, but it felt important to do something, to meet this gift of acceptance with whatever grace she could manage. The men settled themselves on the floor near the fire with easy comfort, and Sarah was struck by how different they seemed now compared to the war party that had arrived at dawn. Tatanka Ohitika watched his son with an expression that revealed the depth of his love and relief, while Wonbli examined the cabin with frank curiosity. Sarah poured hot water over dried herbs to make tea, offering it in her simple tin cups. The men accepted with nods of thanks. "You live alone here," Tatanka Ohitika observed, and Sarah nodded. "Your man is dead." Again she nodded, finding it easier than trying to explain the full story of James's death. The fever that had taken him so quickly she barely had time to understand she was losing him. The chief seemed to understand without further words. "It is hard to live alone on the prairie. Hard for anyone, but especially for a woman without family to help her." Sarah bristled slightly at this, her independence something she had fought hard to maintain. "I manage well enough," she said, hearing the defensiveness in her own voice. But Tatanka Ohitika's expression held no judgment, only observation. "Managing and thriving are different things," he said quietly. "My son tells me your supplies are low. The winter has been harsh. You have shared your food with him even though it means less for yourself." He paused, then added, "This is another debt we owe you. And debts must be repaid." Before Sarah could protest, Wonbli spoke rapidly in Lakota. Tatanka Ohitika listened, then turned to Sarah with what might have been amusement in his dark eyes. "My brother suggests that you are too stubborn to accept help easily. He says this is a good quality, but also a dangerous one. He asks if you would rather starve proudly or live humbly." Despite herself, Sarah felt a laugh bubble up in her throat. The question was so blunt, so perfectly aimed at her own complicated feelings about accepting charity, that she couldn't help but appreciate it. "I would rather live," she admitted. "But I don't want to be a burden to anyone." "Then we understand each other," Tatanka Ohitika said. "You will not be a burden. You will be family. And family helps each other survive." He stood, and the others rose with him. "We will visit again. My people move with the seasons, but we will remember where you are. When we are near, we will bring supplies. In return, if any of my people need shelter or help, you will provide it if you are able. Sarah understood what he was offering. Not charity, but exchange. A relationship built on mutual respect and benefit. It was something she could accept without feeling like she was simply taking. I agree to those terms, she said formally, and saw approval in the chief's face. Ohanzi spoke then, his mixture of Lakota and English words tumbling together. His father listened patiently before translating. He says he wants to return when the snow melts. He wants to learn more of your language, and he wants to teach you more of ours. He thinks you should know how to speak properly so you can communicate with anyone who comes seeking help. The thought of Ohanzi returning, of having these visits to look forward to, filled Sarah with unexpected warmth. I would like that very much, she said, meeting the boy's eyes. He grinned, the expression transforming his face and reminding her how young he truly was. They walked outside together, where the rest of the warriors waited patiently. The sun had fully risen now, flooding the prairie with clear winter light. Tatanka mounted his horse with the same fluid grace Sarah had observed before. Looking down at her from horseback, he seemed larger than life, a figure from another world entirely. Yet his words when he spoke were simple and direct. You have given me back my son. I will not forget this. None of my people will forget this. You have shown that courage and compassion can exist even in times of war. That is a rare thing, and it will be honored. He raised his hand in a gesture that might have been blessing or farewell or both. May you survive this winter, Sarah Mackenzie. May you live to see many more. Ohanzi rode close to his father, sitting straight despite the pain his shoulder must still be causing him. Before they turned to leave, he looked back at Sarah and spoke in careful English. Thank you, Sarah. You saved me. I will not forget. His pronunciation was awkward, but the sincerity in his voice needed no translation. Sarah watched as the 50 warriors rode away, their forms gradually diminishing until they were nothing more than dark specks against the white landscape, then vanishing entirely as if they had never been. She stood in the cold for a long time after they disappeared, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, feeling the weight of everything that had just transpired. The cabin felt different when she finally went back inside. The supplies the warriors had left were stacked neatly near the door, enough to see her through the rest of winter and into spring. But more than the physical gifts, Sarah felt changed by what had happened. 3 days ago, she had made a choice to save a wounded boy rather than protect herself. That choice had led her to this moment, standing in her small cabin with a full heart and the knowledge that she was no longer alone. She thought about Tatanka words, about family and honor and the bonds that could form between people who should have been enemies. The world outside was still harsh, still divided by conflict and misunderstanding. But in this small corner of the prairie, something different had taken root. A connection built on compassion rather than hate, on shared humanity rather than difference. As evening approached, Sarah prepared her meal using some of the dried meat the warriors had left. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, thinking about Ohanzi and wondering if he was safely home with his people. She hoped his shoulder would continue to heal, that he would grow strong and live a long life. The thought brought a smile to her face. That night, wrapped in the beautiful blanket that had been gifted to her, Sarah slept more peacefully than she had in years. Her dreams were full of images from the past 3 days, the boy's face when he first collapsed at her door, the moment his fever broke, the sight of 50 warriors materializing from the dawn mist. But more than anything, she dreamed of spring, of the day when Ohanzi would return to continue teaching her his language and learning hers. The winter continued its relentless grip on the prairie, but Sarah faced it with new strength. She had survived the test that life had thrown at her, had made the right choice even when it seemed dangerous and foolish. And in doing so, she had discovered something precious, the possibility of connection across divides that seemed impossible to bridge, the power of simple kindness to change the course of events, and the truth that family could be found in the most unexpected places. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the land, Sarah was ready. She had survived another winter, but more importantly, she had learned to hope again. And when she saw riders approaching one warm afternoon, when she recognized Ohanzi's form among them, her heart lifted with joy. The story that had begun with fear and blood had transformed into something entirely different, a new chapter in a life she had thought was written in loneliness. Sarah stepped out to greet them, this family she had gained through courage and compassion, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them no longer alone. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and sometimes cruel, but also beautiful and full of possibility. She had found her place within it, had earned her right to call this harsh land home. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift of all.